now I'm going to give you the magical stewardship sermon. It's going to form all of you into perfect stewards of your gifts. Are you ready? Last week, actually, if you were here for Doris's talk, and she and I chatted about this a little bit on Thursday, she said what is possibly like the most perfect little kernel of a sermon about this story that I had never heard before. So that was wonderful, but now I'm just going to end up repeating what she said. Because what she pointed out was, when we think about stewardship or giving of any sort, our minds automatically go to money, right? That's just what we do. That's how our society functions. That's just how our lives work, is everything is monetized in some way. So there's always money as a thing that we think about when we think about giving, particularly when stewardship time comes around in the church. But what Doris pointed out is that this story really illustrates the sort of more complex and more holistic nature of what God is calling us to be as stewards. That the man who helped, the Samaritan, let's just call him Sam for the sake of conversation. So Sam, as he was walking down the road, did not throw a couple bucks at this guy. That's not what made him generous or a good steward, right? He first spent some time. I mean, Sam's walking down the road, presumably with a place to go, right? He's not just wandering around looking for people in ditches. He's got a plan for his day. He woke up with an intention of where he was going to head by nightfall. And he takes some time out of his own life. He derails his own schedule. And he gives generously of his time to this guy on the side of the road who certainly needed somebody to give him a little bit of time. And we don't know what Sam's plan for the day was. We don't know what that time might have cost him, but he gave it without any mark of hesitation as far as we can tell in the story. And then after offering his time, Sam offered some sort of skill that he had, or talent, or at least a basic ability to bandage some wounds, right? Sam may not have been a doctor by profession or a medic or any, he might not have really known what he was doing, but he used what ability he had to take care of this guy on the side of the road. He didn't know who the guy was. He didn't ask who the guy was. He didn't really seem to be concerned about who the guy was, apart from somebody who needed help. And so he offered it to him. And then he offers him a ride on his animal. He sticks him on his animal, his donkey or whatever, and takes him to an inn and stays there with him, spending more time. And apparently overnight, because then it says the next day, he took out 2 denarii. So before we ever get to a discussion of fundraising or anything like that, nobody put out a jug for a guy on the side of the road fund, Before any talk of any of that, the example we have of living a life of generosity, of living a life of good stewardship, is Sam the Samaritan, giving so much more than just 2 denarii, right? Giving time, unless he was planning on going to that inn already, he didn't get to where he meant to go that day. He completely sidestepped his own plan. and allowed for the possibility that something else was going to happen. He used what little skill he had to try and mend this guy's wounds. And then he gave what financial resources were needed, right, to be able to sustain this guy's care. And this is the answer we get to the question asked of Jesus, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? This is not a very clear definition of neighbor. Is it the person, the house right next to mine, sure, that's my neighbor. I got that, right? Across the street, yeah. What about kitty corner across the street? I don't know, it's not contiguous. Are they my neighbor? This is the sort of letter of the law definition we could be getting into here, right? And probably the one the lawyer who's asking Jesus wants, because it's so much easier. It's so much easier to say, these are the clearly defined limits of who I have to care about and what I have to do. And I can set in those limits, I can sit in that rule and just follow it, and I'll be good. But of course, this is not what Jesus ever does, right? Jesus never gives us the easy answer. And I think this goes along well with actually our first reading today, which was from the lectionary for today, but we kept it partly because Jeremy had a wonderful thing to sing about it, but also because it, I think, pairs well with this idea. In our Amos reading, God is a little bit grumpy, shall we say? In our Amos reading, God is saying, I've had enough of all of this empty ceremony that you're doing. Living in that law and just sitting there and just going by the specific words of the definition, doing the things you're supposed to do, it's not really working out. We see that in the story of the Good Samaritan. The Levite and the priest who passed by were living righteous lives according to the letter of the law. They were doing what they were supposed to do. They weren't supposed to get, unclean by touching people. And they probably had something important to do, so they couldn't bother having, the whole ritual cleansing again before they had to go do the thing they had to do, whatever it was. They were very busy. And they were totally justified in their actions by the law, by the letter of the law. And this is what God gets a little bit cranky about in our Amos reading, too. If all we do is look at the letter of the law and do what it says on the page, but not listen for what the spirit of the law is, right? For what the intention behind those rules or instructions or whatever are. If we don't take a moment to consider how the Spirit is moving and working in those instructions, then everything we do, while maybe on paper is perfect, becomes empty. Like the rituals and sacrifices that God is rejecting in Amos. Like the actions of the priest and the Levite in our story from Jesus. Living a life as a member of the body of Christ. Living a life as one of God's children is not just about reading the rule book and following all of the things it says. So that would be really nice and easy. It's about considering What is the spirit of those laws? What did God mean when God told us to do these things? Not just to love your neighbor as yourself, the folks that live next door. But what is the spirit of that relationship of neighbor? And to live generously into that understanding, just like the Samaritan did in the story. Excuse me. The Samaritan responded not according to the letter of the law, because he probably shouldn't have gone near anybody. Nobody liked him. He was a Samaritan. But he responded to the spirit of what God has taught us all. That we're to care for each other. That we're to live generously for each other. Not worrying so much about our own needs in the moment. I mean, if you have to go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom. But, like not worrying about our own needs in the way of there's somebody laying on the side of the road, but I've got an appointment to get to. There's somebody laying on the side of the road, but I just did all of my ritual cleansing preparation for the thing I've got to do later today, and I'm going to have to do it all over again if I touch him. There's somebody lying on the side of the road. Nothing else matters but caring for our neighbor. And trusting that God, who has already cared for us, who has already provided for us, will continue to do so as we do so for others. So living this sort of Good Samaritan, if you will, life of generosity that we've got in this story takes a lot of trust on our part. Trusting God, which we all say we do, but sometimes it's hard to do. And trusting each other. Because if I'm going to be a good neighbor to you, I'm trusting that you're going to be a good neighbor to me. God has provided for us generously in all things. There is enough on this earth for everyone to survive, to thrive. But we need to share generously of what portion of that we've been given. As individuals, as a community, as a society. Because when we forget about the generous God from which we come, we stop living generous lives ourselves and we start keeping things to ourselves that are better spent in the community. So all of this is to say, we should all be like Sam. We should throw our schedules in the air when we see somebody, right? Easier said than done sometimes. We should just derail our lives for the sake of whoever comes asking for help. Easier said than done sometimes. But in those moments when we are feeling called by the Spirit of God to live into the spirit of the law, to love the Lord our God with all our heart and all our soul and all our strength and all our mind, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. In those moments when we are feeling called into that, what we can do, for sure, is remember the generosity that God has shown us. I mean, he made us. That was rather generous of God to create life. God didn't have to do it. God has provided us with this community of each other. God has provided us through baptism with salvation and eternal life, which feel a little bit untangible sometimes, but are ultimately like the biggest gifts anybody could give us. God has given us all of these things with an irrational amount of generosity, because God knows exactly who we are and how imperfect we are, and God continues to give. And so in those moments when we are feeling tugged at by the Spirit, in those moments when we see something like a guy laying on the side of the road, or when we hear a story of something like a guy laying on the side of the road, when we feel that little pull towards living a little bit more generously, let's remember the generosity that God has shown us first. And then consider how God's generosity has impacted our lives. And maybe ask yourself how a little bit of generosity on your part might impact someone else's life. Who is my neighbor? Who was the neighbor? It's just some random guy walking down the road, the least likely in the story to be a good guy, to be a helper. But he showed generosity and care and love. And so can we.